Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about Devon's hidden Elizabethan mansion. It's Hellions, Barton in Upton, Hellions, in the middle of mid-Devon. At first sight, this might well seem to be an ordinary farmhouse with its thatched roof and mullioned windows. However, if you look at the scale of it from the people here, Joe and Mrs. Carew, the owner, you'll see that it is an enormous building. It was built for Dr. George Carew, who was born 1497 to 8, died 1583, the third son of Edmund Carew of Moon's Ottery, a gentry house in East Devon. The Carews were a major landowning gentry family in Devon. By the time George Carew bought the manor at Upton Hellions, he was aged 69, an elderly man by 16th century standards. As a career churchman with Protestant sympathies, who had held office at the royal court and lived through turbulent religious times in 4 reigns, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth. He had become one of Henry VIII's chaplains and had been granted numerous religious posts in different places by the king, each with an income. He was very unlikely to have filled his religious obligations in all of these. He was royal chaplain to Edward VI, who granted him leave of absence from his religious posts so that he could go abroad. And he spent some time in Paris lodging with Protestant associates of Thomas Cromwell. His Protestant sympathies meant he fell out of favour when Catholic Mary came to the throne, and he was deprived of various positions, including Dean of Bristol and Prebend of Wells Cathedral. But this was only temporary. Somehow he managed to restore his reputation with the Queen. She appointed him Prebend of Chichester, Salisbury and Wells, amongst several other officers. A Dictionary of National Biography states that it was Queen Elizabeth who made him Dean of the Chapel Royal, but it's plain from his will that he acquired this post during Mary's reign. When Protestant Elizabeth came to the throne, he was able to shake off any taint of having served Mary, and he was appointed Dean and Canon of Windsor and retained as Dean of the Chapel Royal. This court position was the highest office he held and how he chose to describe himself when he wrote his will. In spite of the wide geographical spread of his religious posts, all of which came with obligations by statute to attend and accommodation, and his responsibility at the Court of London, he seems to have spent most of his life in Devon. Among his many church appointments, he'd been made Archdeacon of Totnes in 1534, and there is good reason to believe that his principal home was in or near Totnes before he bought Upton's Hellions Manor in 1566. Even though he was Dean of Bristol Cathedral and could have, in theory, have occupied the deanery there or the deanery at Windsor. In 1571, he was appointed Dean of Exeter too, and could equally entitled to live in the great medieval deanery next to the cathedral. The questions of why he chose to build a house for his own residence, as the Devon historian Lytton's records, therefore needs some explanation. Keystone considers it might be connected with his probably second wife and their 6 children. The 16th century church establishment considered chastity to be a superior state to marriage. Clerics were not legally permitted to marry. The only exception was a short period from 1549 in Edward VI's reign, after Parliament passed an act to take away all positive laws against marriage of priests. Clerics who had been illegally married before, including bishops, could now display their wives and children but not for long. The Act was repealed in 1553 during Mary's reign. All those priests who had married when it was legal, on Mary's explicit instructions, were to be deprived of their religious appointments, meaning that they had no income for themselves or their family. Some formally abandoned their wives and were obliged to do public penance in church and were permitted to move to distant parishes to ensure that the marriage bond was broken. Others stayed with their wives but had to engage in complicated transactions in order to live together. In 1553, George Carew had been an illegally married priest for 13 years and already had at least 4 children, said to have been born in or near Totnes. He was accepting plum clerical appointments from Queen Mary and must surely have wanted to keep very quiet about his family. As Dean of the Chapel Royal, he would have been provided with superior accommodation during Mary's reign and the reign of Queen Elizabeth, who continued his appointment. She was against clerical marriage, as Mary had been, in spite of their religious differences, but she was less savage and did not deprive married clerics of their appointments. George Carew could not have made the palace accommodation to which he was entitled to as his home, nor could he have lived openly with his family at Exeter, Bristol, or Windsor deaneries. In addition to having children, and by the time he bought Upton's Hellions manor, he had at least 6, meant wishing to pass on the property to his heirs, something that could not be done with a clerical home that was tied to his job. Upton's Hellions Barton then seems to have been built as a fairly secluded home by an elderly man of very high status with royal connections who needed to keep his wife and children out of the public eye. It's not to say he wouldn't have entertained neighbours of status or other connections at Hellions Barton, and that his family had to be completely hidden. There were plenty of other illegally married clerics. 2 of George's sons held significant military and administrative offices under Queen Elizabeth, who is likely to have known who their father was. But a certain amount of discretion about his family would have been necessary. And he would have needed to keep his domestic life separate from his various high-status church offices. His own children were grown up by 1566. His youngest son, Edmund, was about 11 when he bought the manor, old enough to be considered an adult in the 16th century. So a home for children was not required. However, there were children close by. There were grandchildren close by, and he seems to have been looking to leave a substantial family property for successive Carew generations who could be expected to have large families. Carew bought the manor from his eldest daughter's father-in-law, Thomas Dowrich, which kept the transaction helpfully in the family. His daughter, Mary, probably lived with her husband, Walter Dowrich, at Dowrich in Stanford, the adjacent parish to Upton Hellions. The house he built for himself seems to have been a retirement property for him. As the Dictionary of National Biography reports, I note, in 1571, Queen Elizabeth granted him a dispensation on the grounds of old age from travelling to his many distant benefactors to subscribe to the articles of religion in person, as was required by statute. His decline in health seems to have prompted a gradual reduction in his benefices, as he soon resigned Windsor Deanery in 1572, Tiverton 1547, and Bristol in 1580. He seems to have died in London and was buried at St Giles in the Field in 1583, aged 85. At his death, he was still Dean of Exeter, precentor of both Salisbury and Wells cathedrals, rector at Mells and Somerset, as well as Dean of the Chapel Royal. He made his will in 1565, the year before he bought the manor. His wife, the Sussex heiress, born Anne Harvey, died in Suffolk in 1605. Her eldest son, Sir Peter Carew, was killed in battle in 1580 before his father died, and the estate passed on to his second son, George, but he sold Hellions, Barton in 1615. Right. It's the building is a terraced site, an artificially terraced site. We saw on the first slide the flat front garden or yard, and at the back is terrace with a flight of stone steps going over to the middle terrace, and then an upper terrace beyond. I chose this photograph from the 1960s to show the upper terrace, but also to show the rolling Devon countryside and the rich red soil of this part of Devon. The windows to the house are mostly these flat-faced mullioned windows dating from circa 1700. I will walk round the outside. There's a front doorway to the cross passage. Now you're getting an idea of how tall the ground floor is from in here. Local volcanic ashlar stone tree-centered arch with these fine pyramid stops, and early, if not exactly original, ferramenta on the door. The north end of the main block has been massively altered. It's been rebuilt above first floor level, and a new window inserted there. And these two windows, that window and this extra doorway, all inserted in the 1960s. So just those windows flanking the cross passage door were early openings, and they left each end large blank spaces, as if George might be expecting a son or an heir to create, expand with new wings forward into the front yard to create a courtyard. South end of the main block, and here we see a bit more. Here we do see evidence of 1570-ish work. We see here the hood mould over a large ground floor window to what's the dining room parlour at this end, and above here also the blocking of another very large window. It would have originally been gabled. We know that, well, the roof shows that the tip timbers are secondary. This is a south kitchen range projecting from behind the dining room parlour here, and with this amazing kitchen stack with the double shafts, and we don't believe the original house was thatched at all. It was probably slated. And this is the west end of the kitchen range, partly rebuilt in brick there, but the ground floor level contains the only original 16th century window surviving in the house. It's timber with Volvo moulded mullions. This is the north front, as it were, of the kitchen block onto this rear service yard. This is the main stair block projecting out from behind the dining room parlour. And it still has a 16th century door. The door itself, with this fleur-de-lis finial, looks rather 17th century to me, but who knows? We are talking about a man with, up-to-date taste, as it were. So here's the stair block projecting out, which we believe rose up to the attic level originally. Here's the back door to the cross passage, a small squint window from the dining room parlour, and this sash window, I'm not quite sure how easy it is to see, but has the remains of a hood mould showing that it's the site of a 16th century window. And here, the enormous whole chimney, projecting chimney stack serving the whole fireplace. And next, oh no, sorry. There's a detail of the rear doorway to the cross passage. Again, I would have said 17th rather than 1570, but again, it was, we're talking a courtier with taste here. And the yard was enclosed on two sides, the west and the north side, by service rangers, which I'll come back to later. So this is how we envisage the 1570 layout of George and Anne's mansion. Absolutely enormous spaces. Dining room parlour, undershot cross passage, great chamber above there, above both of them. The hall open to the loft, open to 2 stories, and a chamber and a service room at the north end. Now, these are the only, well, these are the main rooms of the house, apart from the kitchen and a couple of service chambers above them. So we assume that George had the great chamber and the lesser chamber at the north end, discreetly tucked away. In fact, the hall now, it has an inserted floor level at this height, which makes me wonder whether there wasn't a gallery connecting the 2 chambers running across the back wall of the hall. Let's look at the rooms. We'll go back. Although it's now covered up, we know, in fact, I saw it in the 1980s, there is an oak screen along this side of the cross passage, a stone wall on that side, with Avolo moulded studs and munting. It's kind of 3-panel high oak screen. And we have evidence possibly for the head beam of the upper end screen, as it were, there, which we found in one of the in the East Range, West Service Range. Oops. And this is part of the head of that screen, showing that it was chamfered over panels, but there were 2 openings in it with richly moulded surrounds. This is too high up, and this is not a doorway, so one assumes that there were windows borrowing light from the hall to the service room, borrowing light from the hall to the service room above 2 doorways into the service end. Also, in the front garden, a few fragments of a volo-moulded volcanic stone have been found, suggesting that the windows, the original windows on the front wall were stone and a volo-moulded. So we have this is the hall today. It has in fact been subdivided. So this wall went in around 1700, or maybe a little earlier. And so the hall was one further bay. And as one can see, there's nothing much to write home about. The original fireplace has presumably been blocked when this partition was put in, and would have been positioned approximately there. And in fact, you know, I'll just go on. Just to compare it with a contemporary mansion from West Devon, 1574, Barton in Lammerton, Edmund Tremaine's house, with its ornamental plasterwork and, you know, joinery and other features which we just do not have from Upton Hellions. Back to Hellions Barton. This is the south end ground floor room, a dining room and a dining room parlour, with access from the kitchen, which is down a couple of stairs there. Here is the doorway to the main stair. In the stair wing, fireplace blocked by a Victorian block, and in fact this too went on further. This is an inserted circa 1700 partition with a small parlour and buttery inside. So much longer room. There were 3 cross beams doing this room. So as I say, everything seems to have, you know, original detail has been replaced or was never there. These beams, so one might expect this to be quite a fancy room in any other mansion, but they're just plain chamfered beams with step stops. They could have taken plaster, obviously, but I think that John and Anne were probably happy to have a relatively plain house. They've done showing off. They're just getting on with retirement. This is the main stair, again, circa 1700, rebuild. Excuse me. There is a cupboard under the stairs, but unfortunately the door has been painted closed, so you can't get in. But the owners say there is the base of a flight of stone steps in there. So there's no obvious 1570 work exposed at first floor level. In fact, there is very little joinery and absolutely no ornamental plasterwork anywhere in the house. You know, they seem to have built a starter mansion for their heirs. Right, working in the times of COVID. This is the long gallery, believe it or not, in the attic space, in the roof space, as it were. Now, up until we worked at places like Holcombe Rogus, I wouldn't have understood the you know, what we've got here, and indeed, Hoskins thought it was all 18th century, but it's not. It's top-notch 16th century work. The trusses, the principles of the trusses, they have these posts, the tie-beam trusses have these queen strut posts, and the underside of the principals are reduced up to ceiling level just to get more headroom in. All this plaster is secondary, but we would have had a well-lit long gallery here. The details of the roof tray in our report, the closest parallel in Devon comes from the North Range of Baltimore House, another big mansion close to Exeter. In our report, we compared it to Sir Richard Berkeley's 1563 mansion at Stoke Park on the outskirts of Bristol, which included a similar 6-bay roof over his Great Hall. In short, we seem to have one or more carpentry specialists who travel the south of England building fashionable and bespoke long galleries for the very rich. So I don't know if any of you noticed that when you flash up your slides in PowerPoint, you get an artificial intelligence identifier, which is often hilariously wrong. This slide here of the beams and the joists was described outside stone with a lizard. The beams are completely sort of just rectangular. They contain a rebate for floorboards, and you have full height upended plank joists with double tenons and with haunched tenons, which we have found parallels in the 1560s and 70s. In the 1550s at Holcombe Rogus, this is how the long gallery floor at Holcombe Court at Holcombe Rogus, this is how the gallery floor is made. And you can see here some original boards. There's the top of the beam exposed. The first board on into the rebate, itself half rebated to the next board, and again you can see the rebate there. And this is the Holcombe Court long gallery, probably late 1550s. The trusses and everything are also quite similar to Hellions Barton. This was built for Roger Blewett, and seems to include small dormitories for children. We think it was probably for children, and maybe used as a schoolroom here at Holcombe Court. Now, the kitchen has this absolutely enormous fireplace. Now, you will remember it had two flues, two chimney shafts. And so it seems that we've got a fireplace, a double fireplace originally. And indeed, that's reflected in the plan of the room. The kitchen is divided by an axial partition. We can just see the south end of it here. It stops well short of the fireplace and extends towards the back, stopping short of the doorway we saw from the service court behind. So it's not a full-length partition, but it does include the only Tudor doorway to survive, the Tudor arch head in the centre of it. I was in touch with Peter Brewers, see if he could throw light on this double fireplace and internal partition. Although he found it, he was very pleased to see it. He said his comment was he'd never seen anything like it. So it is an experimental kitchen I would suggest. Or upstairs at the kitchen, we have two unheated chambers divided by a large panelled cross wall, and a jointed cruck roof. I mean, it's boxed in, but we know from another example it's exposed that they're ordinary side peg jointed crucks. So this is pure Devon vernacular in the unheated servants' rooms. Right, back to the service yard, and we have at the back a 1570s building that was latterly used as a cider house, but we think was built as a coach house and stables. Certainly George travelled to London sometimes, or Exeter, and would have needed coach and horses. Inside we see that it is part floored, which suits it being a cider house, but these beams are thought to, I believe, to be original 17th century beams that are large, and the joists are hefty too, and indeed some have nails suggesting that it was sealed at some point. This is the horse engine house, the apple crusher, and there is the press. The roof was replaced in the early 20th century, but there is at least one jointed cruck post still surviving in the rear wall. Also, the building is built between a cob building here, which is the west range of the service yard, which we'll come to in a minute, and the back of the main block of the house. Right, this is to show why I would think there was this western bay, which was open, was probably a coach house. You can see here a vertical butt joint, and the stub. I mean, the light's awful, it's not flooding in from that end, but there's a stub of a lintel. So we think that this bay once was the coach house doorway. Maybe bay wide doorway for a garage. You see, I mean, it's always been open. There are no joist sockets for first floor extending in this direction on this beam. And here is the west range. I think I've called it west range there, but anyway, sorry about that. It's the west range of the service yard, which was built in cob, but suffered from a fire in 1916 and was heavily rebuilt thereafter. We believe it to have been a service range because we are short of places for servant accommodation in the house. Here's another truncated cruck post from loft level towards the north end of the east wall. This is the line of a demolished west wall of the range, which went after the fire. But we see one of the beams here, complete with a socket for a post. When I've seen such arrangements in cob buildings before, they've usually been in domestic rather than agricultural contexts. Also, a load of reused joists, again, this one on its side, the others upright the right way, with nail holes suggesting plaster, which you don't get generally. You might get in a stable, but you would not get in stock sheds. And indeed, the window we saw above does look rather domestic in scale. So a lot to find out about this block. We think it's got a cross passage through it, but it's work in progress. So, oops. So we've seen all the other farm buildings are later. So what we've got is the main block, a kitchen wing, a carriage house and stables, and a service range, which was probably the complete house of 1570. They must always been worried regarding their position in changing political circumstances. They survived, and Hellions Barton would seem to be a good project for them to live out their older years together, close to grandchildren, and providing an undecorated, fashionable house designed for further potential development by her son. This never happened, so he seemed to be left with what is this? A starter mansion. The design of the house left massive rooms for George and Anne, but very little for servants or storage of essentials. And as far as we can see, no heated rooms for servants. Besides cooks, cleaners, laundry maids, and general skivvies, George would have needed a coachman and a groom to drive him to court to keep his income flowing, even if not through the other places he should have been visiting to fulfill his obligations and justify his income. Thank you. That's Hellions Barton.